And so with that, our first speaker today will be Dr. Stefan Wildius from Virginia State University. We're very glad to have you here. I'm excited to hear about the work that you've done and the things that I've heard. And so with that, I'll let you go ahead and take the microphone.
I really enjoy this opportunity to be here. 50 years of Croix, and I guess I've been part of that for 40 of them. So it just shows you how very old I am. So I'm going to have about 90 slides. I'm trying to make it. Once you start yawning, I take it as sort of a cue and rush through the slides. Okay, just a little bit of background. My association with Croix sheep breed dates back to my time at the University of the Virgin Islands. We established Croix research flock when I started there in the mid-80s. My background up to that point was strictly working with beef cattle. I'd done my PhD with bull reproduction and did some postdoctoral work with cattle, with cow reproduction. I'd really gone to the Virgin Islands to work on the Senegal breed. And then having been there and seeing the breed and having so little done with it and having moved stateside, being available here, I felt there was need to start characterizing the breed as well. So we found some land next to the prison, between the prison and the university, and we started setting up facilities, and we'll talk about it in a minute. And the work we did there, worked to characterize the breeds and its performance. And then just before I left, was able to host a hair sheep research symposium that brought in a lot of people from the stateside and the Caribbean to summarize where we were at this point. This was when hair sheep weren't cool. You went to a scientific conference, there were the cattle talks, there were the real sheep talks, and then you were the very last item with hair sheep, and what's a hair sheep, and people left. So it was some pretty trying times early on. Now, if you go to a scientific conference, and Scott can vouch for that, it's all about hair sheep and Katahdin sheep and everything else. So times have changed, but I did hair sheep, and hair sheep were not cool. And then after I left Croix, continued work with the breed at Virginia State University. Okay, a little bit of the background on the breed. So one publication on hair sheep that came out in the 1980s, really that sets the stage for all of this, was by Dr. Bradford and Hank Fitzhugh, that put together this book on hair sheep of Western Africa and America. As you can see, it's been used, the spine is gone in the copy I have, but that really summarized very well what was out there. And that was the first mention of the Croix sheep. There was done by Dr. Hupp and Dr. Della. Dr. Hupp was my predecessor, and I guess he was the fourth in line of the people that worked down there. And Dr. Della, I doubt he's still there. He was a state veterinarian. And they were approached by Dr. Bradford to summarize a little bit what's available on Croix in the Virgin Islands. And so there wasn't any kind of research flock, so they set out and collected some data in 3 privately owned flocks. And the things that were established, that the ewe weight was about 35 kilograms, the ram 37 to 54. The litter size was about 1.4 in the one flock when they were lambing in February and April. In one of the other flocks, the litter size was a little bit higher, 1.84. And that's really all they could do with sort of an extensive survey of the available population of hair sheep there. And they noticed the main constraints to production were lumpy jaw, which I assume is caseous lymphadenitis, and gastrointestinal parasitism. So the other thing that was known at this point about Croix was about the sheep that Dr. Foote had brought in to Utah State University. It was here, and then I'd hope Dr. Foote will probably talk about this a whole lot more, and Cole Evans might have talked about this, but it started here, then it was sent to locations at OSU and University of Florida. And I think some animals were also sent to Cal Poly to look at the male reproduction of the Croix breed. I think some went to Dr. Shelton at Texas A&M, who used it for sort of crossbreeding studies. So that was the initial footprint of Croix stateside. So Dr. Foote reported then that the ewes weighed about 54 kilograms here, quite a bit heavier than the Virgin Islands. But when they transferred the sheep to Ohio and then Florida as well, we see this more common. 36 kilograms. So the ewes here at Utah tended to be a little bit heavier than everything else that's out there. The litter size and recorded here was 2 to 2.5 at Utah. Ohio dropped to 1.5 to 2.12, and Florida was 1.4 to 1.5. So this is a very early data that was available on the St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, and then again stateside. When I did that, okay, I think that's the problem. Is I don't speak very loud. Does it help? Maybe I need to speak up. Sorry about that. Okay. As I mentioned, when I was in 1992, I was able to organize a hair sheep research symposium. Sort of the aim was to sort of build up on what's available from this early publication. There hadn't been anything comprehensive on hair sheep at this point. And we had said regional research project. It was called a regional research project, but it was really the sheep research project that was out there. I had people from California, from Illinois. I mean, everybody who was working with sheep was part of the project, and they would meet once a year. And then I had joined that group when I started in the Virgin Islands, and I was able to host the conference or the annual meeting there, and I combined it with that hair sheep conference. So it was a really good opportunity to bring some very well-established scientists down. Dr. Foote gave a talk, an update on the St. Croix breeding. Dr. Shelton talked about the crossbreeding efforts. Dr. Dave Thomas, I don't know, you probably don't know about him. I'm sure you know Dave Thomas. They all gave summary reports, and then we got different other contributions at this meeting. And one of them was by Dr. Patterson, and he summarized the information that was available from the Blenheim Sheep Station. I don't know if any of you heard of that. It was a project that was underwritten by Lindrock International, and they were setting up a program to evaluate the Caribbean hair sheep breeds and look at crosses of these breeds to develop a productive hair sheep breed. But he summarized 2 years worth of data. They had about 203 lambings that happened, and for the Virgin Islands whites, they had 1.76 average lambs born, and they weaned about 68.6. So this was right in line with what you have for the other hair sheep breeds. The crosses that they generated did not do quite as well. So this is Caribbean data on St. Croix. There's very little else Caribbean data there. So everything else now we had there was stateside data, and they had established a flock of St. Croix to use the air as Boonville Station. Back then that was managed by Mike Brown. Many of you probably know Joan Burke. Joan later on took over this flock, and one of the very first things Mike did, he looked at the seasonal breeding pattern, and you can see he exposed ewes in August, October, December, February, April, and June. This was a group of about 15 to 20 ewes, and you can see right under these photoperiodic conditions, they showed very much a seasonal breeding pattern. Ewes exposed in April and June had a much, much lower lambing percentage, and then the litter size dropped as well when you exposed in April. Some other information that was presented at this meeting was work done by Dr. Thomas, Dave Thomas, who had used St. Croix and Barbados rams in a crossbreeding trial where we used Suffolk and Targhee breeds. And the two landrace hair sheep did really, really well, having lamb survival at 92%. And then the ewe productivity, in this case, again, the St. Croix, was numerically the highest of the breeds you had there. Now we're getting sort of scanty data. I guess people want to go to the Virgin Islands to the meeting. So if they had sort of touched the St. Croix sheep, they found some data to present. But Moore Solomon, who was a USAS scientist, he was a meat scientist at the Bellsville Research Station in Maryland. And they compared some St. Croix sheep to Targhee, did a meat study, and really there were 4 animals. So it's not an awful lot. It shows that the Targhee were larger, had larger carcasses. The one interesting factor here is that the fat content in the two were about the same. That's what was surprising. You would think the hair sheep would have a little bit lower fat content. The only other study presented then was from North Carolina State by Kevin Pond. He had also looked at seasonal distribution, but that's pretty mixed up data. It's very hard to sort of summarize. So that's what we had at this point on hair sheep. Okay, now I want to talk about what I did during this time in the Virgin Islands. Like I said, we set up research facilities. The campus is right here. There was some land available that wasn't being used, and I was able to convince the university to let me have it. We got some posts, we got some prison labor, and we fenced it in, set some pens up. Then I went to the local farmers, asked for sheep. They gave me ewes, and I told them I would give them lambs back. So that's how we established the flock. There was no money being changed. Sorry, go ahead. So this shows then the kind of animals we started with. Along with the St. Croix, I also developed phenotypically pure black bellies there. So we were running both the black belly and the St. Croix flock. As far as the management of the system, I settled on an accelerated lambing system. People down there they're running the rams along the ewes year round, and you pretty much have lambs born throughout the year. So I figured, well, that lends itself to an accelerated system, except we're doing the same thing, but you have a lot more control over the mating that's going on. And then we took a step further. We had an A and a B flock. So we had 2 flocks managed in 8 months cycle. They were offset, so we would lamb every four months and breed every 4 months. We weaned the lambs at 9 weeks. The ewes were kept on native pasture without any supplement. We used rotational grazing in these 8 paddocks. And back then, the worming protocol was you dewormed in a fixed interval, and we settled for 2 months at this point. So this is the management we had. This then summarizes the performance for the first 5 years. We started with a small number of ewes and then build it up some. So in our system, we had about 1.66 number of lambs born per ewe lambing. Lamb survival at birth was a bit between 92 and 98%, and we weaned about 85% of the lamb crop. The ewes were about 80 pounds, 36, 30, and the range was rather large. Even now in our flock now, we have quite a range. We have some ewes at 120, 110, and we have some that are 80. So 80 is on the low end. And then the ewes weaned approximately 50% of their body weight at 9 weeks of age. We looked at the seasonality that we have down. We summarized January, April, May to August, September. You can see that lambing rate is pretty much the same throughout the year. There were no real seasonal changes. Lamb survival, these lamb on pasture was also pretty similar between the seasons. The only drop we saw in lambs weaned alive dropped to 77. That has to do with rainfall patterns and sort of season, not so much with the animal. And then, can you go back for one? Sorry about that. Jumps the gun. Okay, it just shows what we had for weaning weight of the lambs, and the weaning weight again, because survival was lower, the weaning weight dropped at this time. Other than that, the performance was pretty much consistent throughout the year.
What do you think contributed to that difference? Just the season?
The rainfall patterns and forage availability, because they were grazing, they were not being supplemented, and it's the same weather, but forage growth and quality is pretty much dictated by, and then you can attest to that. Certain local legumes are a major part of the forage intake. They have high nitrogen, and they add to the forage base quite a bit, and that's not available as much during this time of the year. Sorry about that. The one thing we looked at then was also to look at the onset of puberty in these lambs. What we found, they reached puberty on 22 kilograms, about 50 pounds. The males tended to reach it earlier, so the puberty at about 180 days, whereas ewe lambs were a little bit later at about 230 days. In the ewes, it was their first estrus cycle. We had teaser species animals, teaser rams, and we could measure when their first cycle. And then we did a follow-up test and did an ovulation study. And then in the rams, we would try to collect samples weekly, and when the first semen that had about 10 million motile sperm in it, we would consider these having reached puberty. Okay, and no problem. And we then want to see what can we do about the onset of puberty. And we started looking at supplementation. And when we provided supplementation to these animals, we were able to advance the onset of puberty quite a bit. This is about 30 plus days. And you can see again, here it's a magic weight of about 23 kilograms. So one thing we did notice, since we did measure ovulation weight and did estrus detection, these animals that reached puberty at this point that we weren't supplemented tend to have relatively short cycle, whereas these were relatively normal cycles. So that would indicate here that this probably would not be spiral cycles either. Okay, we also looked at growth performance of the lambs, obviously. This is quite a decent growth for Virgin Islands conditions on sort of pasture only. So we don't get that much. It was a good year we did this. But adding supplementation, this was given at basically half a pound per head. We were able to boost, especially if the supplement was coconut meal. Coconut meal has about 23% crude protein, and it's a Caribbean product. So it's a local byproduct, which makes sort of sense. So we were able to bump it quite a bit by providing. And this is about as good as growth rate gets in the Virgin Islands, right? Good question. Okay. We go to the local abattoir, we collected some carcass data, and the take-home message here is by providing supplementation, you bring your dressing percentage up by about 2%, and you will add some more fat to your carcass. Okay. There we go. We also then did a trial to look at sex class. So normally the males are kept intact to grow them out down there. But we started weathering some of them. And then we also had some ewes in there. They were on feed. They were all grown to a target weight. So we had a uniform slaughter weight. And to reach the target weight on pasture only, rams took about a year. Whether still longer, another 30 days. When we start adding supplement to these, you can see we really took about 5 months off these and 3 months and 4 months over here. So that helped a lot getting to a slaughter weight with yielding animals or being less than.
So there was no advantage to castrating?
No, actually it didn't help. Except, you wouldn't have to keep your male separate from the females, but no. Growth rates here, if you go at daily gain, it's 143, even with supplementation, and 106. So we get a real separation. So if you can keep the intact males, these days the virgins, at VSU as well. And later we sort of didn't have enough room. We couldn't keep separate flocks around. So we started putting wethers and we were able to see the very same thing. And what you do then, especially if you weather, but if you supplement, you get quite a high dressing percentage, but you add a lot of fat to this carcass. So that's the other thing. You might not, from a production and marketing point of view, you're going to have many of the people that are buying the product, they do not want that fatty carcass. They want the lean carcasses. So that again doesn't help you. Plus, if you market to the muscle market, they do not want it. They want an intact male, so you cannot really sell a leather to them. And we did another project we did with Dr. Andy Hammond. He was a research leader with the USDA Research Center at Brooksville, Florida. They're working with cattle there, but he had a new nutrition background. So we set up a project to look at growth performance of lambs in a more detailed way. This was done under pen conditions. We fed chopped forage. It was harvested every day, just like what you would see in the Caribbean. It's all cut and carry. People chop and bring the feed to their animals, and they keep the animals on elevated flooring to minimize parasitism and reinfection. So we did the trials. We looked at molasses, coconut meal, and fish meal as supplements that were locally available and readily available. So we did 3 trials that were conducted for 57 days. In trial 1, we provided a limited amount of protein at 9 grams per kilogram per day, and the forage. And you can see in the next slide, we moved on to add molasses to this at 1% of body weight. The second trial used the same other supplements, excuse me. And in the third trial, we tried to fine-tune the kind of supplements we were using. So if you look at the slides now, this is what you get when you feed chopped forage without anything else, harvested at a poor time of the year. You get negative growth. Animals are starting to lose weight. If you added the coconut meal, we're able to sort of bump this up, and the fish meal sort of helped. In the second trial, we added the molasses, so we were able to keep the weight loss. In the forage-only group, we got very good gains with the coconut meal. We got moderate gains with the fish meal. The one thing we noticed in both these cuts, once you add the fish meal to the diet, the high protein content will increase the intake of forage in these animals. So the forage will get higher in these animals. And then the third trial again, even so molasses didn't help. We got lost again, the forage only, and we got some moderate growth. So it has to do with the quality of the forage that's being harvested. Okay. Another project we did since we hooked up with a paleontologist at the University of Florida, Charlie Courtney. But interested, we got a grant funded to look at the epidemiology of sheep on St. Croix. I know Scott's laughing now, but this was a very early onset of doing this. So, no, you can do it at the next level. So we wanted to determine what were the species of relevance down there. And we wanted to see if there were seasonal patterns of worm transmission, and then also wanted to look at the peripatrian or lactation rise and fecal egg counts. For the second study, we used 2 flocks. We used a moderately managed flock, which was the AAS, the UBI flock, and that was rotationally grazed. It's a 2 months worming interval, and we didn't use supplementation. The other flock, the prison, had a small flock that was managed by the inmates, and that was not quite the same level of management. They were on the same pasture all the time. There was very infrequent deworming, and again, no supplementation. And then as far as for the seasonal transmission, we used tracer lambs, so we harvested the stomach content of we sort of harvested these lambs and took the intestine and the abomasum and counted out the worms. And then for lactation, looked at the rise in fecal egg counts. Okay, this is what we got. This is the rain index here, the duration of the study. This is the temperature over here. You can see that Hermancus contortus, or barber pole worm, pretty much followed the rainfall. And if you start looking at correlations here, extremely high correlation. So it was strictly driven by the amount of rainfall, what kind of an infection you would have. For Trichostrontium colibriformis, it was just the opposite. There was some relevance or relation to temperature pattern, but there is no real change in temperature. There's no change in daylight. There is no change in temperature. It's always nice. Okay. And then as far as the peripatrian rise, we had lactating use here at the prison. We had non-lactating use in the prison. We had lactating use at AES and non-lactating. You see a little bit higher body weight in the research flock compared to the prison flock. Same with body condition. As far as packed cell volume, was about 2% increase in packed cell volume under the little bit higher level of management, but there was no effect on parasite burden in these animals, except you do have the lactational rise. Lactating use will have a higher parasite count. That's pretty much in line with what you would expect. Okay? Okay, then that brings me to our Utah State University project, which was really exciting. I was able to hook up with Dr. Foote, and we were able to submit a grant. And the grant allowed us to look at the performance of the breed, especially the reproductive performance in the environment, in the Virgin Islands environment here in Logan, Utah. To do this, they organized feed for us with a complete pellet of alfalfa and 20% barley, and we shipped it down to the Virgin Islands. And they fed the same over here. We used dry lot environments. And for the first trial, we looked at seasonal distribution of estrus and ovulation. And so we checked these animals daily for estrus, and then the occurrence of ovulation was measured by using laparoscopy. We would do that 4 to 10 days after estrus was detected, or if there wasn't any estrus detected, we would then go in the third week of the month and do a laparoscopy then. And this just shows you what we got in terms of environmental conditions: elevation, 25 meters in the Virgin Islands, 1,500 meters in Logan, annual rainfall, 1,200 millimeters, in St. Croix, 380, and probably had only 200 this year. Rainfall patterns very different, elevation very different, and same as relative humidity. We were at 85 and 70 to 85, and it's only 36 to 58 here in Utah. And the main driver of reproduction then is your annual photo period, and you have about a 1 month variation from the fall to the winter solstice, and it's about six weeks here in Logan. So, okay, this is the next slide then. This is, again, this is taken from the proceedings. I don't have the original data anymore. I couldn't recreate the graphs. I apologize for the quality. So this was a good graph 40 years ago, trust me. It was state-of-the-art plotting software done on a KPro computer. The dark bars are the Virgin Islands, and you can see, show to use pretty much for estrus throughout the year. A little big start and then a little drop off here, but pretty much 100% estrus throughout the year. The open bars are Logan, and you can see starting in April, ovulation, estrus shows off, and then when you plot ovulation, it's pretty much the same thing. We have pretty much twin ovulations throughout the year, and St. Croix in both years. We got a little bit of drop in ovulation rate in Logan, and we had fewer animals that were ovulating. So this was really, I thought, was a really definitive study on looking environmental effects of ovulation rate.
Is that mainly January, and when does it drop?
July.
This is March, this is April. It's like, you say, I should have found the data. I mean, I could have sort of made it up and create a better graph, but you have this kind of a pattern here for Logan, and you have basically a straight line for St. Croix. Okay, we also had a second aspect to the study where we looked at the reproductive performance of the ewes. So we had set aside 20 ewe cohorts at both locations. They again were kept in dry lot, shaded dry lot in Logan, Utah. They were bred in the multi-sire mating starting November 1st for 35 days at both locations. Lambs were weaned at 60 days. It was done over 2 years. And we really do not see much of a performance difference in the breed, except again, the body weight of the ewes was quite a bit higher, even so that we're getting both the same kind of feed. But you can see it bumped up the body weight of the ewes in the Virgin Islands, getting that higher level of feed, but we still would not reach what we're achieving here in Utah, and that translated in larger litters. But other than that, if you look at lamb survival and everything else, was pretty much identical. This is misleading here. Coal does what coal does, and I think the rules here said you have to take triplet lambs off their mothers, right? You still do that?
Sorry, say that again.
If you got a triplet lamb,
Yeah.
you take it off the mother.
We have.
You artificially weigh it.
Yeah.
We wouldn't do that. So this is where that difference here comes from. So if you would do it the same way we did, I'm sure we would have the same life and meaning. Well, you may not be set up, but like I said, even triplets here, they did reasonably well. You would lose some, but usually you were able to hang in there. So that's really the only difference we saw in terms of ewe reproductive performance.
Who in here lets their ewes raise triplets? approved as of today. Thank you.
Okay. This summarizes. We did some other things in version analysis, but that's pretty much what I did. And then I left, and then Bob took over. Bob and actually, I was doing a postdoc at Texas A&M, and he was finishing up his graduate degree. We sort of knew each other, and then he took over, and we talked at meetings and everything. Didn't quite agree with some of the things he did, but he dispersed the Barbados blackbelly flock, which I thought not a good idea. We also had a small flock of Florida native for breed preservation purposes and evaluation under the environment on St. Croix. He let that go. He introduced the droppers. And then his successor on the version analysis, I'm sure, is going to comment on what has been done. I was going to summarize Bob's work and that this isn't my place to do this. But what he is working on mostly was comparisons of purebred and St. Croix dropper crosses. He, being a reproductive physiologist by training, he did some work with assisted reproduction in St. Croix. And then I think later on he worked on some regulation, coat color, and heat stress. I think he looked at extended weaning and split feeding. Like I said, that's his research, and I think it's not my place to present it. I'll leave that up to our Virgin Islands representative. Okay, now let's move on to Virginia State University. I started in the fall of 1992. I was supposed to start a meat goat research program. There were 2.5 goats running around, pretty wild. There was really nothing there. So go ahead, have at it. So we did with the goats what we later on did with the sheep. We went and got different breeds of goats. We got representation for each breed with no more than 5 does from a breeder and a single ram, at least 5 breeders represented. So we had some pretty decent goats going. But me being me, I immediately lobbied the administration that we really need to shift this to a small ruminant program and bring some sheep in. So they finally relented. In 1997, we got into Catardans. We did the same thing. We went to 5 different breeders, got 5 ewes and a ram. Then the following year, we did a rescue with Barbados blackbelly sheep. They were from NC State, and NC State was shedding all their hair sheep. And I was contacted by my colleagues there who was working with goats and said, you know, they're about to send them to the sale barn. So we went down and we picked some of these up, and there was a breeder that had already done this. He was a gynecologist at Duke Medical School, and he had picked up a lot of these blackbellies, and he was going to move to California. He said, can you salvage these animals? I said, I sure can. He came, and I could pick out the flock I wanted. He transferred. So that's why in 1998, that's why the St. Croix had to wait till 1999. But we did bring St. Croix in, and I'm going to show you the breakdown in a minute, and the early emphasis. And we set out with the sheep being brought in to look at species comparison, and then look at breed within species comparison in terms of seasonal breeding, parasite resistance, and prolificacy. So I had to tie in the sheep with the goats to make it palatable for the administration. Now, okay, our overall project, being a minority institution, was to service or address the needs of the limited resource farmers and design validated profitable management systems that's suitable for small scale and low input production systems. So that's always been the driving force for everything we've done, trying to keep the small farmers in mind. So we set out to evaluate and develop hair sheep and meat goat germplasm adapted to the production conditions of Virginia and the mid-Atlantic and southeastern region of the United States. Okay, now I want to quickly talk about how St. Croix flock was put together. Like I said, back in 1991, how many people had hair sheep in 1999? So, okay, Lois Carroll, Maryland, was a breeder that was available. And we got 6 ewes and a ram from her. Linda O'Neill was one of the very early movers and shakers. That name might have come up. She was British. And we got 3 ewes from her and a ram. Stephen White, he was a university professor at James Madison University. We had a black flock of sheep. He gave us that. Stanley Bucree was a physician in the Washington area, and he donated 5 ewes. And I think these, I had initially contacted them. You're going to hear that, of course. And then I added sheep from my own flock. And so the Maryland line was obvious. If they were, then we had an NC line, and these were sheep, again, that came from NC State University that were shared. And I got this phone call from my colleagues that, you know, they're going to take your Croix sheep to the sale barn. So I went down, took them home, set up a small pen in my garage, and had these animals, and then found homes for them. So Linda took some, Stephen White took some, I kept a few. So that's where the North Carolina line comes from. And then the sheep that I contribute from my flock was what I call the Clemson line. And that's quite a unique history of these. You remember the name Dr. Duke Deller? He was a state veterinarian. He had written the original summary. Duke had a farm in Indiana where his parents lived. And so every time he was his parents, being a state veterinarian, he would take sheep with him. So he set up the Croix flock in Indiana. When his parents became too old, he got hooked up with Harold Hupp again. They had worked together, and Harold had moved to Clemson at this point. So he brought the sheep to Clemson. And then Harold went on a sabbatical, and I had just moved to Virginia, and he called me and said, listen, I'm going on a sabbatical. Can you take my sheep from me while I'm gone? You can keep the lambs, I'll take the ewes back when I get back. And I wasn't set up for sheep. I was frantically building fences. But I had, what, five, always. So we set up a Clemson line. So this is quite a unique set of sheep we had there and how they came about. So this is what made up the original flock. This just shows you what these animals look like. Okay, so in 2006, we had to have a reset. Joan had decided that they were going to let the St. Croix go, and me being me said, yeah, we take him. So we got 29 ewes and 3 rams from her. Then I also got with Bob and said, Bob, you need to help me out. I need some ram lambs. So he shipped me two ram lambs in sort of a dog cage, and we picked them up at the Philadelphia airport, and we got St. Croix lambs as well. So we reset our sire lines, the foundation line, an Arkansas line, and the University of Virgin Islands line.
I like your bullet points.
I'm a reproductive physiologist. So that's how we come about. So that was reset in 2009. And this has always been a closed flock the rest of the time. We try to keep sire lines and try to keep the inbreeding at a minimum, but it's a closed flock. We had to do another intervention in 2019. I was at a meeting, and I was out of town. I had a little lady work for me. The dogs got in one night and said, move them. I can't move them. She called me next day, half the rams are gone. So, and then we had 40 rams because we had so many sire lines. We're doing reproduction research with semen collection. And so we then had to salvage what we could. And for the St. Croix, I contacted Swiss Valley Farm, and they had done a collection on St. Croix. I don't know if you all know about Swiss Valley Farm.
Get down. Come on. Yeah.
Swiss Valley Farm was that set up to preserve breeds. So they were doing it sort of, any of you have dealt with the National Animal Germplasm Program?
Yeah.
In Colorado? Yeah. So it's sort of parallel, a private system. I've been working with National Animal Germplasm Program quite a bit in collecting semen and storing them in the repository. But they were doing that there with the help of Tufts University. And they had collected St. Croix to preserve them, the embryos and semen and tissues. And so they keep them for a short period of time with their collection, and then they send them out. And they said, well, we can have them, we can do it. Just come to Rhode Island. So I picked up 2 rams there. These rams came from a resort town. They were overlooking the ocean and the yacht harbor. And we took them back to a group of 40 rams where everything goes. So they were in for a rude awakening. But we had to bring in 2 St. Croix rams there. So we had to bring out some fresh germplasm.
Did that dog attack interfere with the ones that you had imported from the
They didn't wipe our lines out totally. So, and then that's because I go to meetings, I got a lot of flack from my colleagues that you're the only one who just put at the 1-to-1 male to female ratio because we have so many rams running around. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so talking about the management of the sheep at VSU, the sheep are managed on a forage-based system. Like I said, they're trying to get economically viable system. And I think for them to be economically viable in the eastern United States, they need to be forage-driven. And I've worked with some forage people, and they were working on trying to get year-round grazing, essentially, that you really don't have to feed any more harvested forages. We're not there yet, but we're working on it. And when we use corn supplementation, it's a time of hay feeding and during late pregnancy and lactation. Me being me, the flock is managed in an accelerated mating system. Initially, we started out with a 30-day mating. We're down to 25 days now in our system. That was November, July, and March. We normally use single-site mating, so we do have parentage on all our animals. And we used to use 2 to 3 breeding groups per breed. And we use lamb on pasture, so it's a fairly extensive system. And back then, the parasite control was done on individual animals on demand. So times had changed. The approach to parasite control had changed. Okay. So our first step then was to compare the sheep to the goats and tell the administration, look, what a good thing you did to shifting to sheep. And we have just some summary data. One of the first things we did when we set the system up, we looked at fecal air counts. You can see the goats generally struggle a lot more with parasites. At this point, that was done in 98, this data. We didn't have this in Croix yet, so we just had Katahdin and Blackberry. So Blackberry was a fairly inbred flock, so they were struggling a little bit with parasites, and the Katahdins did what we would expect from Katahdins. Go ahead. So when we summarize the data, sheep are bigger, sheep grow faster. Keep going. They have better carcasses, keep going. And then we changed the forage environment for the 2 species. We did a trial, we looked at alfalfa hay, chopped alfalfa hay and chopped just normal grass hay. And feeding a better forage increased growth rate in both species, but significantly more in the sheep. Okay, that's fine. We also want to look at parasitism. That is not new. That was also a problem back then. And it was the #1 killer of sheep and goats. And you can see that the hair sheep had lower fecal air counts, had about a 5% increase in packed cell volume. And at this point, we looked at deworming patterns. And we had gone away from on-demand worming. So we would take, every 2 weeks, we would fecal sample our animals and make a pooled sample for each subgroup. And we said pooled sample had more than 1,000 eggs per gram, we would treat the animals. And with this kind of protocol in mind, we had to treat the goats every month. We ended up treating the sheep every 5 months. There's a major difference there. Okay. This is just a visual of this, fairly low egg counts here, maybe up to 1,000 in the sheep, and go up to 3,500 in the goats. And then we looked at breed within species. So we had myotonic. When we started out, we had myotonic goats, Spanish goats. I also played with pygmies some. We had Virginia brush goats, but that was really not a defined population of goats. It was hard to establish. And then we always stayed away from the boar goat. But we settled myotonic and Spanish. And you can see the Spanish really struggled. And here's using Croix. Air counts, even a little bit better than Katahdins. But again, this is, Scott will talk that in detail. This is just us dabbling in just some basic measurements.
Was this the full population, or was it just the young animals, or?
This would have been, you would ask me that. That would be younger animals, okay, because that would be a controlled study. Okay. And then this is again another visual what you have. And this is using Croix down here, the Katahdin in the middle, and then you have your goats on the top. So yeah, go ahead. That then brings us to looking at the early data we got from the accelerated mating at VSU. Go ahead. Before we did this, when we brought these populations in, we were just doing some multiplication matings to get the numbers up. This was again before we had this in Croix. This is just for catardans and black bellies. But we learned a valuable lesson here that the catardans don't really start cycling till the middle of June, beginning of July. Not so much the black bellies, there was no problem. This is lambing date, so if you calculate this back, this is what you get, middle of June, end of June. And the black belly is pretty much a little bit better. So rather than the system we had in the Virgin Islands, we did June, October, in February, we had to go to July, November, and March, shifted back by it. So we didn't want to avoid, because we had catardans and we wanted to make sure the catardans were successful in breeding as well. Oh, this is one of those. Just click, click, click. Till, okay, like I said, breed in July, and then it falls in place. And back then, it was just a single flock, because we needed to generate large numbers of sort of lamb. We had more land available in a number, so we got big groups of lambs to work with. So it was just 1 8-month cycle. It wasn't sub-flocks. It was just a single flock managed with 8 months. Go ahead. This is the very early data now. You can see this in Croix just settled in. They were not doing particularly well at this point, but this is pretty much the pattern you will see. November, peak breeding season, we get about 90 to 100% ewes pregnant. That drops to about 90%, 85% in July and March, going in and out of seasonal breeding during the transition periods. Go ahead. What the in Croix did very well at this point, have high litter size. And you can, the later data you can see that levels out. But this was our initial data when we did this. And so I went in and annualized it, because what are the benefits of an accelerated system? So rather than have an annual 1.8, 1.9, we have about 2.77. Use weaning, they wean about 2.33 lambs, and it's about 62% of the body weight. And if you have an annual, remember the one was 51%. So we bring it up by about 15, 20%. And this is just, go click one more time. Oh, I did this again, sorry. Okay, this, oh man, I messed you up, I'm sorry. Okay, so this is where we found the problem in our system. This is pasture lambing. And they bred in July, the lambs at the beginning of December. And so there seemed to be an indication of problems with survival, pasture lambing, so if it's a rainstorm. But our subsequent data showed this was just initial. Right now, we do not have a difference in lamb survival in the 3 lambing seasons we have. Okay, go ahead. And then, so just some of the management concerns stemming out of accelerated mating. We have to do early mating. Like I said, we dropped from 35 to 25-day breeding season. If you just do the math, if they breed at day 30 of the breeding season, you're not, they still got the lamb on them if you try to breed them again. So that's a no-no. So what we do in our system now, we've been done it for many years, is we feed MGA. That's the only sort of pharmacological interventions we do. You know what MGA is? Melanogastrol acetate. It's used to suppress heat in feedlot heifers. It's an oral progesterone. It's a cattle product. So I bought a bag, and I'm still using that bag. And I've been dealing to colleagues. So I'm dealing MGA. What we did, we made bags that would make a batch of feed and put in the freezer, and the activity is still there. And like I said, this is probably 20-year-old supply of MGA. But you can get in small amounts, and it beats buying feeders. It's much, much cheaper. Plus, so what we do now to induce early cycling, we feed the ewes, we mix it into a corn soybean ration at about 60% protein feed at 1% of body weight for 10 days, just before the males come in. And that helps sort of give sort of flushing effect. The ewes are just coming off lactation, so they're not in a very good body condition. So that helps with body condition. And once we take them off the feed, takes the MGA out of the feed, 2 days later, everybody starts cycling. Pretty much everybody. So the rams really have to work for that 2-3 days. And then you want to keep, if you have a ewe starting to conceive late in the breeding season all the time, you might have to get some out of the system. So that's as far as early mating. When you do accelerated mating, you have to really keep an eye on the udders. Make sure you don't get any lumps and mastitis. And then the weaning of the lambs. We don't have creep feeding, but we supplement on pasture. And by the time we wean, all the lambs are eating the feed that we're feeding to the ewes. So they're pretty well set to go. But we have to watch parasite control. But for us, it's not so much parasites, being Croix and Barbados, but scouring and coccidia, a major problem. So we're mixing coccidiostat into our weaning ration. And we have a number of trials going on where we're trying to get away from corn and soybean meal to soy hull and corn gluten feeds as agro byproducts, being sustainable. But even then, we just really have to watch that we don't lose the lambs. We're doing good, but there might be some depression in growth rate. So this was the lessons learned. A little bit of forage feeding of hair sheep. Go ahead. This is a pasture feeding trial we did in spring. We did this corn soybean meal mixture that I talked about would have been 16% crude protein. And this was in pen and pasture. They got chopped forage in the pens. The lambs were sold 163 days. This is when we still had the catardans. We no longer have catardans. You can see, as you would expect, catardans are heavier, performing pretty much the same in pen and pasture. Barbados blackbelly are lighter, again, perform very similar between in pasture. Only the Croix show a difference in performance in pen and pasture, and to actually do better on the pasture. So, and this is pretty much what I would have expected from the blackbellies as well, because the land-raised breeds tend to do a whole lot better if you leave them alone on pasture. If you try to feed out them, it's not going to work. Okay, we did some carcass work again, but you expect more back fat on the catardans, intermediate on the Croix. Then just our little dabbling with gastrointestinal parasites. Go ahead. We worked with Dr. Ann Zajac, but she was your. She was on your committee, yeah. That's how old I am.
That's a whole, yeah.
Yeah. I remember you giving that talk and getting blasted. Okay, so we did some worm counts on these animals in 2003, and you can see that the Homunculus contortus and abomasum in the Croix was lower than blackbelly and catardin, and then also trichostrongials in the small intestine were lower in the catardin than the other two. Go ahead. We repeated that. This 2004 year, we added fecal egg counts. It was a study where we compared pen and pasture gains, and pretty much what you expect. If you raise them in pen with less contamination, you get lower egg counts. That translates into lower worm counts in the abomasum. But again, here, this in Croix have lower. This is just what Scott's going to probably explain to you why that happens. Okay, this is just in visual again. This is catardin having a lower PCV than the two land-raised breeds. It's early stuff, very basic, just to get an idea. One of the other things we worked on, I was just talking over lunchtime. We get a lot of questions, what do you do do you have any breeding stock available? We have a little bit of foot problems. We got it under control, I think, but it's definitely not clean animals. So I was always hesitant to let animals go. Plus, being a university, it's hard to do a private treaty sale. So I was always a no, we don't. But then we started doing it. We put starter flocks out. People came and said, I really like what you're doing. I think I can mimic this, can we get? So we said, we call it breed preservation. I got my administration to sign off on it. I said, look, we're working with ALBC. We're working with the National Animal Germplasm Program. We have to preserve these breeds, so we need to get them out. So, but another way of doing it is maybe explore liquid semen AI. And again, small farmers, small flocks, keeping it simple. Go ahead. So we looked at extender we could use for just cooling semen without freezing it. We looked at skim milk only, skim milk with egg yolk, skim milk with glycerol, skim milk with egg yolk and glycerol, and you can see that skim milk with egg yolk retains motility in this extended semen rather well up to 72 hours. So that was our default. Go ahead. We did some other trials looking at cooling rates and everything else, but basically that's what it is. And then we tried to find a very simple system of basically mimicking what the ram does. You just insert the syringe at a 45-degree angle, try to approximate where the cervix would be, release the semen, and that's insemination. I apologize for the blackberry we end. We did this in part 2. Go ahead. And so we did a pilot trial just to sort of a proof of concept. What are we going to get? So we took some nulliparous lambs of the ewe lambs of the 3 breeds. We synchronized feeding them with MGA, and the lambs were bred in a 5-day window. And that was not the induced heat, but the heat after. So usually we might have some problems with induced heat. So we're really trying to optimize what we can get. What we would do then, we would inseminate the ewes 10 to 14 hours after onset of estrus. We would put teaser rams in and determine when they're cycling. And then half of the ewes were inseminated twice. We did a second insemination 6 hours later. It was done by deep vaginal deposition. Deep, you just insert the ram and pipette in 45 degrees, and it's not hard. I can show everybody here in about 5 minutes how it's done. The semen was collected on the day of insemination. We used 3 rams, and we would mix the semen, so there would be no ram effect. It would be just a mixed. And the semen was extended with skim milk powder. And we're no longer using skim milk powder for that. You can get UTS milk. It works even better because if you use skim milk, you have to heat it up to activate it. But if you use UHT milk, it's already done. So you just have to mix the egg yolk, and then you can use in your kitchen table. Go ahead. That's what we got during the 5-day eye period. 85% of the ewes displayed estrus. 75 of the ewes were pregnant. 67 were pregnant following a single dose. 87. These are small numbers, so be careful. So it's 86% if you did double insemination. That's the same semen stored for another 6 hours in the refrigerator and then inseminated again. 60% on the blackberries, 80% on the St. Croix. These would not come out statistically significant with the numbers we have, but it gives you an idea what we get. This is when the moon is right over everything, it shines white. This is optimum conditions. So now we try to move on. You know how it is, right? And so if we go on, we tried this in our ewes then. There was no more time day eye. It was time day eye. We didn't check heat. We would just inseminate. When we thought they were coming in heat after so many hours after we stopped synchronization. I think this was done with CEDARs. So we would just have said 48 hours after CEDAR removal, we would inseminate. So use fresh semen, we can still get about 60%. It's not the quality of the semen this time, it's being able to sort of time it with ovulation. And if you store the semen, even 12 hours, it still works, but it starts losing it. 48 hours of witching hour. I can get semen to swim in a motile fashion for over a week. Take them out, and we did this every week. We'll check it swims just fine, but fertility tends to drop. It starts probably at 24, and at 48 you're done. Okay, so we then tried to test the system and did some on-farm trials. Again, apologize. We have more. We did it with St. Croix as well, but these are small flocks, and there were people that had asked about, can we get ram? So I don't want to sell you ram, but we'll give you the semen and we can do a trial. So we did this. So we would go to the farms, drop the semen, show them what to do, and leave the semen there. They would do a second insemination, and we pick up the cooler and the guns up later. And what we did with them, we sent them the CEDARs. They would insert them again. Some of the low conception rates, you're going to see the fertility rates has to do as much with the quality of the semen as with the timing of the AI. But if you have an on-farm trial, it's really hard to get this straight. Go ahead. This is what we got then. We did in 2014, 2015, 2016. I think Farm D was a Katahdin farm that wanted to use St. Croix to improve their parasite tolerance. Numbers are extremely small, but it averaged around 50%. And it's not particularly high, but if you do this just before you have your natural mating season, you do it the week before basically, then put your natural ram and you're not losing anything in terms of the ewes staying open. And you might get some offspring, especially a male, that you could use for your breeding program. So I thought that might be a viable system. And if you looked at individual rams, that's what you get. You get some, everything stuck. You get some, nothing stuck. Again, looking at 40 to 50%. The first 7, I think, are black bellies, and these would be Croix. Okay, we did, like I said, our system was out to get an effective and optimal production system for small farms, forage-based, but bringing a terminal sire in might be one option to increase productivity. We're a little bit hesitant because we were pretty set. The last so many years, we have not used the dewormer. So we haven't dewormed animals like forever. And bringing a terminal sire in might mess that up. But the lambs should have hybrid vigor, and there might be some compensation for that. And we have an accelerated mating system. So not all breeds are suitable for this, because you need a breed with a relatively long breeding season to do the transitional matings in March and July. So we settled for the Dorsets, plus they're readily available where we are. Virginia Tech has a ram sale, and they have a Dorset flock, so we could easily get the Dorsets. This shows some of the rams we used. That's the kind of lambs you get when you cross with Dorsets. And it was a 4-year project. We did accelerated mating, and we replicated it. So that makes it a 4-year. It's 3 matings in 2 years, that's 6 matings in 4 years. We used single sire mating with 3 breeding groups for each breed. So we had 9 breeding groups every time. And we went about doing this. This summarizes the data. New performance, the fertility dropped a little bit using the Dorset rams. Purebreds were a little bit better. I wouldn't have expected it here, but I would have sort of expected here. I'm sort of expecting that here. This was extremely high for this cycle here. We usually don't get 90% in July, we more 85. This is very low, so those two measure out. And then the litter weight, as you would expect, the crossbred lambs are heavier. This might have been that the litter size was different, so that compensated for that. We had higher litters in the purebred matings than we had in the crossbred matings, so you end up getting that. Go ahead. Then looking at the lamb performance in this is the crossbred lambs. This would be the purebred lambs. So we're getting about a 20% increase in performance of the lambs. And that translates on, we'll show you in a minute, some feeding trials we did with these lambs, so that translates over. So doing terminal sire mating gets you 20%. Problem is, how do you keep your purebred population going? So for us, it wasn't a problem, but if you're a private farm with a small flock, you might have to consider that. And lamb survival was not really different between the purebred and crossbred lambs. Okay, then we used these lambs to look some more at pasture supplementation. I had set up a little grazing system, was mostly fescue and the meadow grass pastures. We got some kaolin gates set up so we could feed individual animals on pasture. And we wanted to evaluate the level and type of supplement. We kind of looked at soy hull and corn gluten as opposed to traditional corn supplementation. We did 3 trials with purebred and crossbred lambs in different grazing seasons. The lambs were fed in individual stations, and we looked at growth, fitness, and carcass data. This then shows what you get. This is your crossbred lambs receiving supplementation. So if you provide the crossbred lambs with supplement, gives them a chance to express their potential, the growth potential. This is what you get without supplementation. And then if you supplement your purebred lambs, they perform like the terminal sire lambs. So if you don't want to do it, you can compensate for that crossbreeding by supplementing, and then you get relatively poor growth rates if you have purebreds on pasture only. But this is what happens to the parasites. You supplemented. Purebred lambs basically are parasite-free. If you don't provide supplementation, they behave like the supplemented terminal sire lambs. And then if you don't provide the terminal sire lambs with some sort of supplementation, you're going to start seeing parasites. Okay, next slide then shows a comparison in terms of carcasses. We don't see anything in terms of purebred and crossbred. We've taken the animals to Fort Valley State University in Georgia to get them slaughtered. I had a colleague there, and he did cholesterol profiles and fatty acid profiles and everything. But this is just the basic data, and except for the carcass page, which is really meaningless, that's identical data But if you go look at the supplementation data, if you compare pasture only with pasture with soy how, we can see how carcass weight was. You get a major bump in dressing percentage and a little bit of loin eye. This is loin eye corrected for the size of the carcass. So that's an actual, it's independent of this being a larger carcass. Go ahead. And then this is another trial we did in May and June. This is spring grazing. This is optimal pasture conditions. So here we're getting 118 grams per day on pasture only. That's really, really good. So that's fescue pasture at the beginning of the season. So that's really good pasture. But even then, this is about as good as it gets. We get to 200 grams per day in this pasture only. But we have some crossbred lambs lumped in here as well. So final body weight quite a bit higher with pasture supplementation. Again, when we supplement, even then, this is parasite season. In spring, we get quite a bit of quite a reduction in fecal egg counts in these animals, and again a bump in PCV. Go ahead. And this is then the carcass data for the trial where we compared gluten feed and soy how, and the two feeds basically perform the same. Corn gluten feed is about 70% crude protein, soy how is 10% crude protein. So there is a difference. There's a real palatability issue with these. So we didn't feed at a very high level. We have a trial going on right now where we're feeding a mix of soy how and corn gluten feed because we like to get the protein up to help with growth and also with parasites. And we have trouble eating it. They eat the soy how, and then next morning you come and it's just all gluten feed, and we're forcing them. But I think that we can go up to maybe 1.5% in this next, and then they start shutting off.
So they don't have the corn gluten.
No, it has a palatability issue,
Okay.
but it has higher protein. Okay, so the last thing, so everything is a circle. So we lost some land. I was stuck by myself with one little lady that was older than me, trying to manage all the sheep. So we had to sort of find a system sort of proof. So we went back to doing smaller groups, but then we had an A and B flock subsystem. And the aim was to see, can we produce lamb throughout the year? Because that's what the small farmers have. They raise the lambs, they take them to the farmer's market. And then if your product once a year, you can keep your customers. But if you can take product throughout the year, you contain your customer base. So, and we figured with this system, we can probably achieve that. So we went back to the subflock system, have an A flock, a B flock, and they both feed into a lamb flock. The lambs are kept together on pasture. They get weighed, and when they reach the target weight, whatever target weight you decide, 75 pounds, they're ready to be marketed. And the system was meant to be forage-based. So we have fescue base as our permanent pastures, but we have a number of annual pastures, summer and winter annuals, cool and warm season annuals. And we're not quite there yet, but we're pretty much grazing year round. Go ahead. And so this summarizes the first 2 years. We've done it for several years now. This is just initial data. And we're right back there at 94%, 93% November pregnancy rate, dropping to about 85 in the following. That's pretty much consistent. We got this nailed down now. Go ahead. Some year-to-year variation. When we look at the number of lambs born again, that's what we get. 2.1 in November, 1.8 in March and July. And again, that's pretty much repeatable within 0.1, 0.2. Go ahead. And then when we looked at the offtake, this is early on, like this is the initial data we did, 17, April, August, December cohorts, and April cohort. And then, so we do get lambs it's at 75 target weight throughout the year. Groups are a little bit small here, and you could work on that some. And so we are doing a systems approach. My colleague and I, Dr. Brian, we got a grant to build a mobile processing plant that you can take to places. And it's not a high throughput, but you can do about 5 to 10 lambs on that. You can kill one day, process the next day. You get USDA inspection so that the product produced can be passed on, can be sold at the farmer's market. And so this system would fit in with this kind of a slaughter system. where smaller numbers of animals are being processed. Go ahead. So it's sort of proof of concept. I know people are falling asleep now, so I'm trying to get through this quickly. Now, this is fine. That semi-continuous production system. We are starting to have lambs now at 7 months of age at breeding. If you do your normal 8-month cycle, there is 3 months or 6 months. You can breed at 3 months, so by default, you're breeding 6 months. Then in the dual flock system, we now have the opportunity to expose some lambs at 7 months. Like I said, our flock size is very small. We have 70 breeding ewes, breaking down whether each lambing has about 35 ewes, 30 ewes. So you get 45 to 50 lambs, which is not an awful lot, but we have some lambs. So we're going to try to expose these. So the groups are very, very small, and getting the production data, you need large numbers. So we've been doing this for several years now, building up numbers. But this is what we got so far. In July, I don't know why I did this. Let's go back in November. November, everybody breeds. This is adult females, 100%, or 11 months replacement, and even the 7 months old. They're cycling. This hasn't been persistent. We had some other ones where this dropped a little bit, but everybody breeds. Now, if you go in March and July, this was quite low here. We should have done better. It's about 90, 95% for the adults, 80% for the 11 months old, and the 7 months old yearlings, so essentially don't breed. They show heat. We're getting heat data in about half of them, but when we do the pregnancy testing, they didn't quite conceive.
So this is showing that those first readings need to be within a certain time period in that November, the first.
No, this is our normal. We just saw these lambs in our breeding group. It's a single male, so we test our males before we put them out. We do a semen test, we do a libido test, because they have to breed up to 50. In this case, something that had breed up to 50 ewes.
Wow.
In 2 or 3 days. Yeah, they're busy. But we're sort of pushing it in November especially. And then they'll pick up stragglers on the second team. Now, the take-home message here is if you want to expose at 7 months, don't do it in July and March.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have an accelerated system and you have that semi-continuous production system, do it. November makes sense, but you're wasting the time.
Okay.
And
so you were absolutely getting the young.
they breed at the right time of the year.
In November.
Yeah, but what you have to do, we didn't keep, but we kept one now. But I was asked again about selling stock. We had these young ewes bred now, and I really didn't want to take the sale. But I didn't want to lay them out here, but we don't have enough room because we keep 36 ewes back, confirmed pregnant ewes, and then we use those for ewe feeding trials where we look at reproductive performance and different nutritional management. So we have some bred ewes that we aren't keeping, and especially these. So we definitely weren't going to keep those. And I didn't want to sell a known pregnant ewe to the sale barn. So I was explaining to Travis that we put out a sealed bid to we have a database of producers we use for extension. And when we have field days and everything, my colleague is extension specialist and she has a mailing list. So we mailed it to the mailing list and said, okay, we have these bred ewes available. If you send a sealed bid, whoever has the highest bid can get the animals. And so we don't do any favoritism or don't favor anybody. So that's the way we've been doing it. So, and they're lambing them and they're giving us feedback. Go ahead. But you have to push them a little bit with our system. I think we expose, it doesn't, in November, even they're barely 50 pounds, they will breed. It just, I'm a little bit nervous if they're ready to lamb, if we don't feed them well till the lambs come about. Okay, the last thing I was going to talk about, we have been looking at switching things over to have a very sustainable system. And for me, that means you don't feed corn and soybean meal, but you feed ruminant feed, which is, in this case, corn gluten and soy hull, because that's readily, there are other feeds available, but that's, you can buy it bulk, fill your feed bin, and it's relatively inexpensive. So we have been traditionally using corn soybean meal to feed the last trimester of lactation. We feed at 7.75% of body weight. And then once they start lambing, we bump this up to 1.5% of body weight. And during lactation. And so we did a trial where we broke them down in different groups. We had six groups, 3 of each, where we compared soybean meal with corn gluten. We looked at other ones too. We did it, let me take one step back. We did a pre-trial to see what happens if you don't give any supplement. And so we bred a group in November mating. This is when nature intends for it to be. So the lamb in spring when we have decent spring pastures. And we had a group that got soil only and got another group that got just pasture. The productive performance was not that much difference, but we saw the problem with breeding back the ewes, and we saw that the lambs were having trouble surviving and getting onto other feed. So we said, okay, if we can make this work in November, we're definitely going to make this work in March and July. So this was so we said we have to provide some supplement. For the level of production we want, we have to have some type of supplementation. So we compared corn soybean meal, what we have been using traditionally with soy hull, and we used the same level of supplementation. And we had different forage environments. July mating has a different forage environment than March and July matings, November matings. Go ahead. And this is what we get then. This is your corn soybean meal. This is your soy hull, and essentially perform the same. Very boring. This is the weight gain during the last trimester. Pretty much the same. They do a little bit better, but this is just numerical. If you do the statistics on that, it doesn't really matter. They're about the same, but we do get some loss in body weight, even though we bump the supplementation up. Go ahead. And this is just summarizing one more time. We get 2.5 lambs in November, 1.7 the other seasons. We get a little bit litter birth rate in that time, but the breeds right now, Croix and Blackberry, at our level perform the same. Even so, I tend to think we're doing a target weight study now to define exactly what's the ideal slaughter weight for the lambs. We look at 75, 85, and 95 pounds for our blackberries. We're looking at 85, 95, and 105 pounds for the Croix. So we do give the Croix credit for being the larger breed. And then we go them up to this point and then run them through a little processing unit and have been collecting carcass data. And again, we're trying to build up a database. And right now we're probably looking at 95 for the Croix and 85 for the blackberries as the ideal slaughter weight on a pasture-raised lamb. Okay, I think there's one more slide after this. I did go in and looked around a little bit of what else is going on with Croix. My colleagues at Langston University, International Goat Center, my foot, they switched to hair sheep as well. And then Fort Valley was to be another international goat center. They asked me to get some blackberry sheep. So everybody, but I did this before everybody else did. So anyway, they have that. They did this for a study on environmental stresses like brackish water and low feed. And but then now I know they're doing a study looking at the new nutrition during gestation and lactation, even though we have already done this. Anyway, they have Catardin stoppers and Croix. It started in 2013. And but I think the project initially was looking at performance, and they gave them waters with different levels of saline. And then I just found out that at Tuskegee University, she's doing silver pasture work, and she has a flock of rather nice looking Croix she uses for silver pasture research. Okay, and I'm sorry I took so long.
Oh, you're great.
And this is what I have. I think there might be one more slide just to show animals grazing. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them if I can.
Are there any questions for Dr. Williams?
So I'm just curious, how many Croix sheep in the US, and is the population pretty inbred, or how diverse is it? Because you mentioned multiple groups.
Yeah, we have essentially a closed flock for the first 2006. So it was 2099. So for some years, that was a closed flock. Then we did this refreshment because the animals became available. We were going to do the rescue. And then it was closed again. We should probably do some analysis. We haven't. I want to tell myself we haven't seen a drop in productivity, we have an inbreeding. But I think we're at a point now, we probably need to talk to I need to talk to some of the breeders here and see what we can do to
Yeah, because
bring
I'm
it.
just curious,